We come to a particular issue today that is a pretty hot issue. Any church you go into and you begin to talk about this issue, you're going to get in a wide range of emotional responses because it's really tied very, very closely, as I suggested in my prayer, to our children, and there is hardly anything more dear and more precious to us than our own children. And oftentimes, if there has been somebody in your congregation who comes to you and asks for some kinds of advice, and you'll quickly find out that either an immediate member of their family or an extended member of their family has struggled with this issue, and more often than not has been put on some kind of psychotropic drug in order to deal with ADD or ADHD. So, let's talk about what are we dealing with when it comes to this particular problem. ADHD is essentially defined by the APA as inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity persisting at least 6 months and defined as having 6 or more of 2 groups of characteristics. And we'll take a look at those 2 groups. There's what we call the inattentive category, which is the first group. And that particular group has 9 different symptoms of behavior. The other category is the hyperactivity or impulsivity category as defined by the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. There's 2 broad categories here. Hyperactivity and inattentive category. And the inattentive category has 9 characteristics to it, and the hyperactivity impulsivity category also has 9 symptoms to it as well. And so you notice the definition that's given here. This is where symptoms persist at least 6 months. And I think one of the reasons why they describe that is because every child to some degree will manifest some of these characteristics off and on. But they're saying that these characteristics have to persist for about 6 months. And having 6 or more of the 2 groups of characteristics, then they would label a person as having ADHD. Now, there are 5 classified types of ADHD. There is ADHD-IN, which is basically the inattentive type. And this is usually the type that a lot of school teachers have problems with, especially with young boys. This can be with young girls too. But especially with young boys, they seem to be non-attentive. They don't seem to sit up as erect in school or pay close attention to the instructions the teacher are giving like the young girls will. And after a period of time, the teacher will oftentimes request some kind of a psychological assessment of the child so that the teacher's thinking from their perspective, will actually be helped to become more attentive, probably through the administration of drugs. Or that second broad category is the ADHD-HI, which is the hyperactive area. This is where basically the child can't sit still. It's what my grandfather used to say, "Johnny, do you have ants in your pants? All right? Are they biting you? All right? And the fact that you can't sit still, all over the place." In fact, as I take a look at some of the characteristics of ADD and ADHD, I'm sure when I look back upon my childhood, I would have been labeled and probably drugged to the maximum in order to, if I were living as a child today. And I would have been diagnosed with this particular problem. Then there's what they call ADHD combo, which is both the inattentive and the hyperactive together. Occasionally you get the combo. And at this particular point, we would probably say as Christians, they indeed are little vipers in Christian diapers at this point. They are really struggling. They're not just inattentive, but they also can't control themselves, and they seem to be fidgety and all over the place. Or the fourth type is hyperactive impulsive type, which is a newer category primarily applied to preschoolers. And usually they say if a preschooler is hyperactive impulsive, then the next step is full-blown ADHD. And it's funny how many preschool teachers have picked up on this terminology so quickly, and how quickly parents buy into this and eventually put their even preschoolers on mild forms of drugs in order to calm them down. Or there's just ADHD, not it should be otherwise specified. When the evaluator's not sure of what category the person is to be classified in, then it's just the ADHD not otherwise specified. So those are the 5 basic categories out there in the world of ADHD. And the treatment, oftentimes if the child is inattentive, the first course of action is not primarily drugs, but usually some kind of behavioral that usually runs the vein of some kind of behavioral Skinnerian approach of rewards and punishment, or some kind of positive reinforcement that's given to the child in order to get them to be more attentive. If the child is hyperactive or it's the ADHD combo, more often than not, they're much more quicker to go towards the drugs, because they see this as some kind of chemical reaction that's going on in the brain or the body of that child that forces that child to be that way, and no amount of willpower in that child or character development is going to change that child. Usually they're much more prone to go the chemical route when they see the hyperactivity or the combo of both the inattentive and the hyperactivity. Because they're preschoolers in group number 4, there's not as much a likelihood, they're not quite as quick to put them on psychotropic drugs to deal with the problem. And the ADHD, that's not otherwise specified, again, all of it depends upon the system and what they expect of the child. Usually the circumstances. If the child is in a family that is has high expectation academically of the child, it's interesting how quickly that family will actually press teachers and physicians to administer medicine so that that child will calm down and learn. Very, very high expectations of the child that can come from mother or father or both, and a combination of both. There are even certain racial groups of families that have very, very high expectations educationally, and expecting the child to achieve and to achieve at a very, very young age. And so there is a tendency oftentimes to put that child on drugs to get that child to listen and to learn quicker and better. Whatever the shortcut is to learning, that's what they're willing to do. But anyhow, those are the 5 classified areas of ADHD. Now, there are a multitude of medications that are used for ADHD, and here's an introductory list of them. There's stimulants, there's antihypertensives, there's antidepressants that are sometimes used, and anti-anxiety medications, which are some of the stronger ones. And Ritalin, and you understand that Ritalin is a very strong pharmacological drug. It is a controlled narcotic. Ritalin is a controlled narcotic. Now, in the American military, now this used to be not long ago, back in the early 1990s, late 1980s, if at any particular time you had ever been on Ritalin, they would not put you in any kind of combat situation. They would not put a gun into your hand because it was considered to be a mind-controlling agent or a mind-altering agent, and as a controlled narcotic. And so as a result of that, they weren't sure what bizarre manifestations the Ritalin would have on you later on. You may end up shooting all of your fellow soldiers in some kind of bizarre incident. Since then, the Army quickly woke up to the fact that too many American children were being placed on this drug and they weren't going to have enough recruits, and so they ended up dropping the policy. But the policy, to my understanding, was not dropped primarily because they thought that it didn't alter the person's mind. All right, it's still listed as a controlled narcotic. Okay, and in fact, back a year or two ago, I was reading some statistics of drug usage in New York City, and the drug of choice in New York was not methamphetamines. It was Ritalin. Ritalin was the drug of choice. And most of that had basically come through primarily the school system and the administration of drugs through the public school system to the students there, to the point where the students really got used to the drugs and actually started using them recreationally, and they realized that it gave them a good buzz. It helped them. So Ritalin, Adderall, Concerta are all very common drugs that are used in order to treat ADD or ADHD symptoms. In fact, you have there now in your notes some of the charts that I'm going to throw up here in order to, and I'm not going to spend a long time on these particular charts, but I do want to give you some kind of an idea of the side effects of these medications. There is the category of the drug, there's the category that these drugs that fall under, and then there's the drug itself, and then there are some of the actual side effects of these drugs. Methylphenidate is a whole category of drugs that include Ritalin, methylene, metadate, fulcolin, Ritalin SR, methylene ER, methadate ER, Ritalin LA, methadate CD, and Concerta. And there is a whole list of side effects from these particular drugs and the effects they can have on children. Depending on the dosage, depending on the weight of the child, how large the child is, and how much the physician or the psychiatrist prescribes for the child. For Ritalin, methylene, methadate, or metadate, I should say, or generic MPH, it includes insomnia, decreased appetite, weight loss, headache, irritability, stomach ache, and rebound agitation or exaggeration of pre-medication symptoms as it is wearing off. So, a child can have a lot of complaints, and for a child, a serious issue also is weight loss. If the child is relatively young, the child doesn't weigh very much, and they're going through growth spurts in the body, and yet the body now is losing weight as a side effect of this. And incidentally, this is why a lot of girls that are going into puberty that have a tendency during that particular time to be very self-conscious about their looks. And in going into puberty, they begin to gain weight in those middle school years or junior high school years. A lot of girls now look to drugs like Ritalin because Ritalin basically not only gives them the kind of in a sense, capacity to be able to focus and concentrate better in school, but also helps to keep their weight down in a similar way, and control their appetite as well. It's a weight loss type of drug, or could be used in that way, and has been used that way. Focalin has all the same type of symptoms that we just described, and there is a suggestion that Focalin, dextraisomer, may be less prone to causing sleep or appetite disturbance than Ritalin, methylene, Metadate, and generic MPH. So it may have a little bit less of an effect in that way. And then there is Ritalin SR and methylene ER and Metadate ER. And it has very similar side effects: insomnia, decreased appetite, weight loss, headache, irritability, and stomach aches as well. Then there's Ritalin LA, which has insomnia, decreased appetite, weight loss, headache, irritability, stomach ache, and rebound potential. With those two, Ritalin LA and Metadate CD. Concerta, insomnia, decreased appetite, weight loss, headache, irritability, and stomach ache again. All right, so you get this idea that this has these drugs, at least these methylene phenidate type of category of drugs, has numerous amounts of side effects to them. The second category here is dextroamphetamine, Dextrostat, and Dexedrine are the two that are in this category, and you can see the side effects: insomnia, decreased appetite, weight loss, headache, irritability, stomach ache, rebound agitation, or exaggeration of medication symptoms as it is wearing off, may also elicit psychotic symptoms. In fact, I've read articles on older children on Dextrostat who were manifesting hearing voices that weren't there, almost labeled schizophrenic in that sense. And so there's psychotic symptoms. I'm going to show you an illustration of that just came out in the news today in just a few moments. And then the Dexedrine and Spancel, it had the same kind of symptoms as well. Then there's the mixed amphetamine, which is Adderall, had the same symptoms, and Adderall XR, which has the same symptoms as above as well. So all these symptoms, and I want you to really pay close attention here to the psychotic symptoms that can occur, where sometimes they're manifested in children in being fearful of going to bed at night because of voices they hear, or when they're really quiet, they actually may see things that aren't there as a result of some of these drugs. All right, the last category of drugs then, actually the last three categories, but the last box here, or chart, is Atomoxetine is one type of drug, which is often referred to as Strattera. In children, the side effect is decreased appetite. The intestinal tract, the GI, is upset, and it can be reduced if medication is taken with food. Sedation can be reduced by dosing in the evening, and lightheadedness. In adults, insomnia, sexual side effects, increased blood pressure can come. bupropion, which is Wellbutrin IR, Wellbutrin SR, and Wellbutrin XL, all had irritability, decreased appetite, and insomnia as well. Alpha-2 agnosis, I guess, is the way it's pronounced. I'm not sure. But I think that's the way it's pronounced. Catapress, which is sleepiness, hypertension, headache, dizziness, stomachache, nausea, dry mouth, depression, nightmares. Catapress, a patch, same as Catapress tablet, but with skin patch, there may be localized skin reactions. And 10x, compared to clonidine, lower chances severity of side effects, especially fatigue and depression, also less headache, stomach ache, nausea, dry mouth, unlike clonidine, minimal problem of rebound hypertension if doses are missed. All right, now, there's no way in the world that I profess to be an expert on all these drugs, not even close. But if you do a little bit of research on these in the PDR, which is the physician's desk reference, or if you do it in the nurse's desk reference, which sometimes is an easier type of reference to consult, then you can pick up the side effects on a lot of these drugs pretty quickly. And I just provide that to you to help you to think through when there are people within your congregation that you're shepherding or counseling, and their children are on these particular drugs. You may wonder about some of the child's bizarre behavior or constant complaint of irritability, or the fact that they're not sleeping well at night, or they may go to extreme where they have psychotic reactions to the medications. And in fact, one of the things that I wanted to highlight for you was something that actually one of the other students in a previous class was showing me earlier today, and I'm going to see if I can get this over here on the screen. This is actually at AOL.com. And here at AOL.com, I think you can see down here on the left-hand side of the screen, new warning for attention deficit drugs. And as you scroll down a bit on here, it says, in Washington, February 21st, drugs prescribed to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder will include guides to alert patients and parents of the risk of mental and heart problems, including sudden death. A patient takes part here as part of this picture in a study on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The FDA ordered manufacturers to warn patients that ADHD drugs carry risk, including sudden death. And here it asks you to go through a survey. Have you ever been treated for ADHD? Yes or no? What's your reaction to the new warning for the ADHD drugs? I'm surprised or I'm not surprised. So they're asking for a drug. Now here's the article. It says the Food and Drug Administration said Wednesday that it detected the manufacturers of Ritalin, Adderall, Strattera, along with all other ADHD drugs to develop the guides. In May 2006, the agency told manufacturers to revise the labels of the drugs to reflect concerns about the cardiovascular and psychiatric problems. Draft versions of the guides posted on the FDA website include discussions of reports of increased blood pressure and heart rate in the ADHD patients, as well as cases, notice this, of sudden death, and in some who have heart problems and heart defects. In adult patients, the reported problems also included stroke and heart attack. The alerts also cover psychiatric problems, such as, listen to this, here's the psychotic issues, such as hearing voices, unfounded suspicions, manic behavior, of which there is slightly increased risk in patients who take the drugs, the FDA said. The guides also tell patients and their parents of precautions that they can take to guard against the risks. Then they go on and say, Wednesday's announcement came roughly a year after two panels of the FDA advisors recommended that the drugs include such patient medication guides. The announcement covers 15 drugs, including extended release, patch, and chewable versions of some of them. Ritalin is manufactured by Novartis Pharmaceuticals Corporation and in generic form by other companies. Adderall is made by Shire Pharmaceuticals Incorporated, Strata by Eli Lilly and Company. And then they go on and say that ADD affects an estimated 3% to 7% of school-age children and 4% of adults, the FDA said. So you can see this is a very relevant issue. This is something that is becoming much more of a serious problem, the side effects of drugs, than we first, or then I should say probably like this, than the pharmaceutical companies want us to believe. This is a critical problem. I have a quotation here that will probably help you on this particular issue. Should we use ADHD medication? Peter Breggin, who wrote, along with his wife, the book The War Against Children, is a psychiatrist, director of the Center for the Study of Psychiatry, and professor at George Mason University. He also sat on the board of the National Institute of Mental Health here in the United States. So he is no slouch. He's a psychiatrist among psychiatrists, a leader. And he makes a statement. Diagnosis and medications cannot meet the basic needs of children or replace components missing in their lives. Almost invariably, psychiatric interventions suppress the child and substitute for resolving conflicts in mutually satisfactory ways, and they are not good for the brain. Now, that is a huge statement by a leading man in this field. And I think, really, basically, under the guise of love, school teachers, administrators, sometimes counselors, medical doctors, and parents administrate these drugs to children. In order to deal with something that I believe on a biblical basis could be dealt with through good, consistent, faithful biblical counseling. Not only do I believe it, I've seen that happen. And probably I need to give you an example. And the example that I want to give you, I have asked permission of this particular family, the people that I'm going to be describing, to give this particular illustration. Because I think it represents a very realistic, as well as a very dramatic illustration on how God can change even the life of a child. Back several years ago, while I was in the pastorate, we had a woman in our church who was a grandmother. Even though she was a grandmother, she really wasn't that old. She was probably in her early 50s, maybe late 40s, but she was a grandmother. And what was really sad about the situation was that in the previous 4 or 5 years, her daughter had become a teenager, and her daughter left the home and decided to strike out on her own. And eventually her mother tried to continue to make contact with her, but to no avail, and eventually lost track of her daughter. Now, to understand this woman's situation, this grandmother basically was the only Christian in the family. Her husband was a horrible drunkard, and in fact, he owned several convenience stores around town where his major sale was that of alcohol. So he had ready access to lots and lots of alcohol. So he was a drunkard. So here's a Christian grandmother who is faithfully committed to Jesus Christ, living with a husband who is a horrible drunkard. Her daughter's left her, run off. She doesn't know where her daughter is. To top things off, her mother, the great-grandmother, lived with her and she cared for her mother. And to top things off even more, she had a sister that was 32 years of age that had been, from birth, severely deformed, and basically body and mentally she was almost an imbecile. She couldn't speak or talk or read or write, and was basically laid up in bed, severely deformed. This 32-year-old woman whom this grandmother had to care for, along with her mother and a drunken husband. She had to change her diapers and feed her, etc., etc. We're talking about a pretty hard life. Come to find out, Grandma realizes that she is a grandma. That her daughter, Carrie Lynn, had given birth to a little baby girl. And this had happened a few years before, and little Carrie Lynn was about 5 years old, 5, maybe 6 years old now. And she discovered, as a result of this, that Carrie Lynn's mother, the grandmother's daughter, was a prostitute. Almost every night she was in a different man's bed, and Carrie Lynn, the baby, the granddaughter, was going from home to home or motel room from motel room, and that's the way Mom made a living. Not to mention the fact that Mom was on all kinds of hard drugs. Grandmother, of course, when she found out she had a grandbaby that was under those kind of conditions, she urged her granddaughter to return home, or her daughter to return home with the granddaughter. To no avail. She tried everything she could to get her to come back. And so as a last resort, she went to court and sued her daughter to get custody of the granddaughter. And she won in court. She was able to get custody of her granddaughter to sort of, in a sense, salvage an already really bad situation. Little Carrie Lynn came to live with Grandma. Now, Grandma cares for her mother. She cares for her 32-year-old, severely deformed sister. And she has a drunken husband that comes home every night drunk. And now she's got little Carrie Lynn, who is the devil incarnate. All right? This girl is bouncing off the walls. She brought Carrie Lynn to church. After the first couple of weeks in church, I had a lineup at the door of my study of Sunday school teachers and children church workers saying, "Pastor, we got to do something about this girl." All right? And I'm going, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. So I called up Grandma and I said, "Grandma, we need to work on this problem because you can't continue to bring Carrie Lynn to church and have her totally disrupt everything that's going on here." And she says, "Pastor, I know. I just want Carrie Lynn to have some kind of good influence in her life." And I said, "I understand." I said, "Are you willing to come into counseling and help work with me to help Carrie Lynn really learn what to do and how to respond to life, even as a little girl?" Yes, I'm more than willing to do that," she said. So she started to come into counseling, and I started to work with Grandma. Come to find out, not long after Grandma had sued in court and brought Carrie Lynn in, that the courts had decreed that Carrie Lynn needed a psychiatric evaluation, and in doing so, they had labeled Carrie Lynn with ADHD. And Carrie Lynn was placed on Ritalin, the highest dosage of Ritalin that I'm aware of for a girl her size, in terms of body weight. And that seemingly had no effect on Carrie Lynn. I mean, this is how wild this girl was. She was just a wild woman, all right?
How old was she?
She was about 6, 7 years old when we got to her. And she had not been disciplined at all. She had basically been allowed to do whatever she wants. When her mom was in some kind of drug-induced stupor, she could just basically, it's a marvel she didn't kill herself or burn down the house or whatever it is, or maim herself in some way. It's just a marvel that didn't happen. But by God's protective graces, I guess it didn't. And we started working with this gal, and as weeks turned into months, Carrie Lynn started to respond. Now, she was on the maximum form of Ritalin that I've ever heard of for a girl that age. She was sent to a special behavioral school to try to correct her behaviors, and nothing seemed to be working there. But Grandma was working with Carrie Lynn from Scripture and making sure she was defining every moment of her day as being responsible, and that she held Carrie Lynn responsible for the decisions that she made, and impressed upon her that Carrie Lynn, not only was she disobeying Grandma and people around her, but she was also disobeying God, which was far more serious. All these issues were brand new issues for Carrie Lynn to hear these kind of things. But Carrie Lynn began to respond. To make a long story short, eventually Carrie Lynn was completely off her Ritalin. She was doing very well in school, so much so that not only did she get out of the behavioral school, but they put her in a Christian school in the area that was known for its high academics. And in addition to that, she graduated later on from the high school, that Christian school, with honors, and got a full ride scholarship to a secular university. I'll never forget the last day I preached my last sermon in that church. Grandma and Carrie Lynn came up to me with tears and rolling down their cheeks, saying, "Pastor, we don't know what we would have done if it were not for you." And I said to them, "You know it wasn't me. It was the Word of God and the Spirit of God at work in your life." And they said, "Yeah." And we all cried together. And now the reason why I tell that story is I tell that oftentimes to parents who come to me, and I don't care whether they have a son or daughter that's bouncing off the walls and are manifesting 6 of these supposed 18 characteristics of ADD or ADHD. And these parents think that they don't have the time that's going to be needed to work with this child. And I don't buy that at all. If this grandmother, who's taking care of her invalid mother, her severely deformed sister, has a drunken husband, can take care of Carrie Lynn and work with her, and God can bring about changes, which is Carrie Lynn. Now, oftentimes the guys are the worst cases, but for me, in my counseling experience in this area, Carrie Lynn was the worst case that we ever dealt with in terms of ADD and ADHD. If God can use Grandma to deal with this particular issue, then God can use parents. Don't tell me you don't have enough time to work through your child. Don't tell me that it's a shortcut. I don't care what it is that's going on in your life. As some kind of shortcut, you've got to medicate your child. Don't tell me that. I don't buy that issue. That just doesn't work with me. So what are you going to do? How are you going to handle this particular problem? Well, what we want to do is focus in the time that we have here on these 2 broad category areas. And then I'm going to make some concluding remarks at the end. And we're going to take a look at all these different systems and give you an initial biblical response. There's certainly much more than we could provide here than what we've got in your notes. But at least give you a framework to get started in working with ADD children. We're getting back to talk about ADD and ADHD, and one of the things that we were talking about over break I wanted to bring up in the class is that it's interesting. Some of the studies that are done, at least here in the U.S. on this particular problem, and this is pretty well established, that one of the most common denominators that's a part of the background of an ADD child or ADHD child is some kind of significant turmoil that has gone on in the home. The marriage is having problems, or mom has difficulty with anger or depression, or dad does, or there's a combination of mom and dad, or dad's got a problem with alcohol, or mom and dad has a problem with drug abuse. Just like in Carrie Lynn's situation, the children, we could say, in a sense, are the barometer of what's happening in the home. So these kids then come to school and try to sit still and listen to subjects being taught, and all this turmoil has gone on at school. Well, these kids are going to start manifesting that turmoil. They become the barometer of what's happening in that home. That seems to be one of the most common barometers of what's happening in the home. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every child that's been diagnosed with ADHD, then the parents are having marital problems. It doesn't mean that. I don't want you to come to that conclusion. But it can be a clue as to there's some problems in the home. And it can, those problems can be multiple in their dimensions, or multiple types of problems that are out there. You need to think through that issue very, very carefully in working with children. So let's take a look at the inattentive category. First of all, in the 9 symptoms that are a part of the inattentive category. Symptom number 1 has to do with behavior often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. That's the first symptom. As I said, if they were diagnosing me years and years ago, this certainly would have been true of me. I can remember sitting in English class, which bored me to no end, and trying to maintain self-control in English class. Okay? From a biblical perspective, we want to help the parents understand what was the child's goal when making those careless mistakes. 2 Corinthians 5:9, the Apostle Paul talks about the fact that we make it our goal to please him. And of course, 1 Corinthians 10:31, we're supposed to do everything to the honor and glory of the Lord Jesus Christ. So we're supposed to do everything to glorify the Lord. That's supposed to be our goal. What was the child's goal when making those careless mistakes? Now, it's important that you help the parent take this area and help to teach it to the child. That doesn't necessarily mean that once you've taught it to the child's cured. We're not talking about that. But there is a growing understanding being taught to that child of their accountability for being attentive. I mean, some of the most often repeated verses in the book of Proverbs is the verses where Solomon as a father says to his son, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." And then he says, my son, in chapter 2, "If you will receive my sayings and treasure my commandments within you and make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. If you cry for discernment, lift up your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasures, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God." And then verse 9 says, "Then you will discern righteousness and justice and equity in every good course." The implication is you've got to give yourself to be attentive. This is not something that comes naturally to a child. Attention is not a natural thing. So Solomon actually needs to admonish his son to be attentive. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, probably had ADD. And especially later on, when he really messes things up in the kingdom. Here Solomon is trying to get his son to pay attention. This is the whole issue. Then we say here, evaluate by generating a checklist of most frequently made errors. Where Where are the errors that this child is making? What are the most frequent errors that this child is making? Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 29 says, "Do you see a man skilled in work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men." So you're trying to help that child learn excellence because that honors and glorifies God. You help them to see where they're making the most errors so that they can focus more of their attention on doing their work well. They make careless mistakes. How many times when I was in grade school did I complete an exam thinking that I had done really, really well, and then when I got my grade back, I was shocked, and I had missed some really easy questions because I just read over them quickly. And I assumed what the answer was, and when in reality I had just not been careful about it. All of that has to do with attention. So how much attention is your child making or taking to important issues in life? That's the question. That's the first symptom of the inattentive category. The second symptom of this is they often have difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or in play activities. The counsel that you need to give them is stewardship of the mind that God gave you. 1 Peter 1:13 and 14 and Proverbs 1:8 and 9. While we're in Proverbs, we'll just turn over there real quick because Solomon deals with this here. "Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching." And the word for teaching there with mother is the word Torah. Don't forsake your mother's Torah, your mother's law, if you will. "Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck." Now, Freud would have interpreted the father's teaching and the mother's Torah as being part of the superego that really restrict the vital part of man's psyche, the id. From Christian perspective, instead of viewing mom's Torah and dad's teaching as being bad, it's actually good. Just the opposite of what Freud says. Freud says it's restrictive. God says these teachings are good and you need to pay attention to those teachings. Now, this gives me a clue here as the fact with an ADHD child, oftentimes mom and dad have failed at this point. They have failed to instruct properly. They have failed to pass laws properly in the home. In other words, the child is basically, like Carrie Lynn was raised without any parameters at all. So she could bounce off the wall. She could do whatever she wanted. Nobody had any expectations of her, and everybody always considered her to be a victim. No, that's not the way it should be. One of the things that you can do with a child like this is help to stretch their attention for longer periods of time by doing the following things. Setting a timer. Say, okay, yesterday you were able to focus on this particular problem for 5 minutes. That was really good. Today we're going to try for 10 minutes. All right, let's see if you can work on this for 10 minutes. Give them a challenge that they can achieve. Or you supervise and monitor the child's activity for a period of time. Okay, I'm going to watch you for the next 15 minutes and see how well you do here. Or you use taped books or puzzles or building toys to help them learn concentration. So you're introducing a dimension of play or fun into it, but you're also teaching them self-discipline and concentration on a problem. It's amazing with ADD diagnosed children. If it was a legitimate brain problem, and by the way, there's no study in the world that has definitively pointed to any kind of brain problem in a child, organically caused brain problem. There's nothing that has determined that to be the definitive cause. That's not true. But that's assumed there. But let's say, for instance, the child is struggling with their capacity to be able to concentrate and really focus on problems. The more you introduce fun things that they concentrate upon, the better it's going to be. It's amazing how the ADD child or the ADHD boy can fidget in school and be diagnosed as a victim of a particular problem, and yet you put them in front of a video game, and that kid, whoosh, is locked right in. If this was a biological problem, that kid would not be able to do that. He couldn't help himself. He'd be all over the place. But you put him in front of one of those particular games, and he's riveted on that. His concentration is right there. How is that possible? Because that's what's fun. That's what he wants to do. This goes back to a heart issue. What do I want to do? And a child, the Bible says, will always opt out for that which is more pleasurable for the moment rather than for long-term good. If you say to a child, you know what, I'll give you $100 and you can go out and buy $100 worth of candy right now, a child that's under 10 years of age, or if you're willing to wait 3 months, I'll give you $100,000. A child will take the $100 every time. Why? Because that child knows they can get it now. They're pure existentialists. Whatever brings them pleasure at this given moment in time is what is the highest good in their life. All right? And that is true with the ADHD child at that point. Question? Yes?
Do you happen to have any specific experiments that psychologists and psychiatrists tend to try to refer to, say, well, see, ADD is a biological problem. This experiment proves it.
Well, there are a lot of studies out there that attempt to say that it is a biological problem. Yes. And that's not all you have to do is Google it, and you'll pull up a lot of stuff. Or you refer to some of the more scientific manuals. The APA's journal, the APA Journal of Psychology and Psychiatry, will have studies on this. But even if you read the studies carefully, the studies don't ultimately prove it with hard science. They'll always use the terms, well, this study suggests, or it seems to be, or points to. But there's this proves definitively on the basis of hard science that this is absolutely the core. You're not going to hear language like that. They obscure it in probability language is what happens. But all you have to do is, if they cite the study, say, oh, great, I'd like to read that study. Can I see it? And if you read through it, you'll find out that this is probability language. There is nothing out there that has demonstrated this to be the case. So, stretch that child's attention for a longer period of time. Furthermore, in this inattentive category, this is symptom number 3. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. This particular child doesn't seem to listen when you speak to the child directly. What's the counsel that needs to be given here? Failure to listen is selfishness and a refusal to give honor. Again, Solomon has to come back to his son time and time again and say to him, listen, my son, pay attention. Give your ear to wisdom. Follow me. Hello, are you there? Over and over again. While we're still in Proverbs, let's go to Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 20. We're not going to cover every verse that we've got listed here. You can do that on your own. But we'll just hit a couple of them. Listen to counsel and accept discipline that you may be wise the rest of your days. Verse 21 says, many are the plans of a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord, it will stand. And then, 1927, then says, cease listening, my son, to discipline, and you will stray from the words of knowledge. In fact, Proverbs 19:27 implies that there is a wayward principle in every one of us, and especially in our child's heart, where when we cease to listen to discipline or give ourselves to discipline, we will naturally stray from biblical morality, from the words of knowledge. We'll naturally stray. There's no such thing as treading water or staying in one point. The wayward heart, when stops disciplining itself, will naturally drift away like a boat without a mooring from the dock of knowledge. And that's the way a child is. That child has got to exercise and learn that exercising concentration and discipline is really critical here. Get the child's attention, give clear visual and verbal instruction, enumerate with fingers, and oversee the task. Again, the emphasis that we're trying to make here with the ADD child is there has to be constant parental supervision. Some children are very, very responsive to correction, and other children are not. In the long run, I'm more concerned in the long run of a child's life of the child that always wants to please me. Because they're the man pleasers, and that's really hard to break long term, than the child that is openly defiant. Because I mean they're being what they are. You know, they're not concerned about pleasing man. If that were true, you know, they wouldn't be doing this. But they're just laying their whole life right out on the table so you can deal with it. So you make sure you hold them accountable for their particular tasks. Require verbal response each time the child is spoken to. Okay, you can look at that child and say, okay, James, I want your eyes to come back to, I want you to look at me here. All right, what was it that I just said to you? I want you to tell me, what was it that I just said? Well, you told me you wanted me to go back to my room and pick up the mess that I made with all my toys. That's exactly right. Now, how long am I going to give you to do that? You said a half an hour. That's right. And the clock is starting to tick. So you better get up there and do that. Otherwise, there's going to be consequences. James goes up there. All right. Every now and then, with an ADD child, now with a child that's somewhat obedient, you're not going to have to check in on him very often. With the ADHD child, you're going to have to check in on them often, about every 5-10 minutes. How you doing, James? How's it going in there? Oh, yeah, I got to clean my room. They're gonna, and then they get distracted and they start playing with their toys again. James, how's it going? Oh, yeah, got to go. All right, got to do this, and then they get distracted. Oh, and then they go back again. So you got to require some kind of verbal response to make sure it gets through. Use variety in the way that we communicate with them as well. Use variety in way. You can use fun and theatrics and mystery and intrigue and positive comments throughout the entire activity. Whatever you use in communicating with them, that's fine. God uses variety in his communication with us. It's almost as if all of us are ADD children of God. All right? So he uses a variety of ways of communicating and uses a lot of illustrious language, metaphorical devices to catch us and our thinking, to intrigue us, to urge us, to implore us to respond to him. In the same way, as a good parent, we need to do the same thing with these kind of children. Symptom number 4 has to do with often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores or duties in the workplace, not due to oppositional behavior for failure to understand instructions. No, this is someone who just doesn't follow through. So we say children must not only start well, but they've got to finish well. This is important. It's not enough to just merely start things. A lot of kids and a lot of Christians are great starters, but they're lousy finishers. They start a lot of good things, a lot of good intentions. You've probably seen some students like that in seminary. They start the semester with a lot of great intentions. I'm really going to discipline myself this semester. I'm really going to work ahead. I'm really going to get this done. And as the semester wears on, then the plan starts to fall apart. And then at the end of the semester, they're back in the same place they were. They're just pulling their hair out. And no. They got to end their project as well as they began their project. That's vitally important. Parents must quickly come down on God's side of the issue every single time with this kid. Symptom number 5 has to do with the fact that often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. What's the counsel you need to give them? Orderliness. Orderliness is a godly characteristic. How to order their life is a very godly thing to do. Everything has a place, and everything must be in its place when it's not being used. So helping the child to set up his room in an orderly fashion, so toys go a certain place, shoes go a certain place, clothes go a certain place, the bed has a certain arrangement, the things on the wall have certain arrangements, and that it's supposed to be kept there normally. In the details of that child's life, that needs to be kept. Oftentimes, there are some parents that I've run into that have this philosophy, well, I discipline my child and I work on my child when they're out around the home, or they're out in public, or they're out at church, or they're out at school. I do all that stuff. But when that child goes into his or her bedroom, closes the door, that's their private area. No, it's not their private area. This is mom and dad's area just as well as the child's area, and mom and dad expects them to keep that as neat as anything else in the house. So everything has to have a place and be in its place when it's used. Category number 6 then, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that requires sustained mental effort, such as schoolwork or homework. Now we're getting close to seminary stuff, aren't we? Hard doesn't mean impossible, right? Doesn't mean impossible. Children must learn to be responsible in this particular area. Frustration leading to giving up requires parents' determination to assist, insistence on completion, patience, and kindness until the child believes he can do it. Otherwise, the child, if you let the child, he will or she will just give up and they won't do it anymore. You can't do that. Again, this requires very persistent parental involvement. Now, I realize this becomes harder when you're trying to counsel a single mother. I realize that. But again, if Carrie Lynn's grandmother can do this, then any single mother can do this. Okay? This is not that, or I mean, it's going to be difficult. I don't want to give you that idea. But it's not impossible for her. So you're getting this idea. It's not just convincing the child that the child can change. It's convincing the parents that they can do it. All right? That's the big issue. I think that's going to be the big hurdle that you have to overcome. All right, symptom number 7 in the inattentive category. The symptom here is often loses things necessary for tasks or activities at school or at home. The counsel you need to give them is teach the biblical doctrine of stewardship, 1 Corinthians 4:2. What I expect, I will inspect. That's very important. What I expect, I will inspect in life. Romans 14:10, 2 Corinthians 5:10. So the implication is we don't want to lose pencils, rulers, calculators, writing paper, books that are necessary for tasks, either at home or at school. We don't want to lose them. Where is it? Everything has a place and everything in its place. Where is it? Well, how come it's not in its place? When was the last time you used it? When you find it, what are you going to do with it? You're going to put it back in its place. That's vitally important in order to teach them personal discipline. That's symptom 7. Yes, question.
When you're in a counseling situation like this, how much time are you actually spending directly counseling the parents on how to do this, and how much time do you actually devote to talking with the child?
That's a great question, and I didn't clarify this earlier. How much time do we spend with the parents talking with them about this, and how much time with the child? I spend almost no time dealing with the child. I counsel the child through the parents. That's God's ordained authority. So, and the parents are the key. They're absolutely, and if it's not parents, guardians or whoever it is, foster parents that you're counseling, it's part of your church, they're the key to seeing that child dramatically change. Because they have to be in that child's life every day. You cannot, in the normal counseling time that you have, resolve that kid's problems. It's got to be the parents. You've got to teach them how to deal with their child in a special way. Maybe they've had previous children that didn't have this problem. Well, that's great. They consider themselves blessed. I mean, they just had the normal discipline. But they have one child that's especially really high maintenance, an ADD child. Then they're going to have to sacrifice extra time for this child and be on them all the time. It's the same way that a parent with a physically disabled child has to do. They have to realize, listen, I have no options here. I have to care for this child from morning until night, possibly even for the rest of my life. Same thing. This child is just going to require more attention. Symptom number 8. The behavior is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. What's the counsel? Work on mental priorities. Mental self-discipline. Asking them, what do they think about? What are they thinking about now? What should they be thinking about? And then teaching them how to focus on those thoughts and be productive with those thoughts. My remembering this is important to God, so I will make it important to me. In other words, the important things that they need to remember is important to God, so that it's got to become important to me for that child. Use a cause and effect, not a bailout system. A cause and effect. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. So, this is a child that's easily distracted by all kinds of extraneous stimuli. Which brings us to the second broad category. From inactivity now to hyperactivity, impulsivity category. Symptom number 1, often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in his seat. Here, the child just can't sit still. This is where the child, again, has ants in his pants. All right, the ants are constantly biting him, so to speak. And generally, guys have a greater problem with this than girls do. You can attribute some of this to just hormonal differences with a guy or a girl. And a girl tends to want to sit there and tends to want to listen more, even though some girls are exceptions to this. So a guy sits in church and he'll squirm and he'll not want to, listen very carefully. My mother had a very effective way of dealing with this. She would quietly put her hand around my shoulder and give me a very painful pinch. And she tells about doing this when I was a little boy in church one day, and everything fell silent right at that particular point, and I said, "You pinched me!" She still reminds me of that. I don't remember the episode, but she does very vividly. And she was a marked woman at that point. So, yeah. But apparently I was being very fidgety, but my mother was doing exactly what she needed to do to remind me that I needed to control myself. And the fact that a boy has to struggle to do that internally is a good thing. That's what develops his character. The struggle's not bad. So teach the character quality of attentiveness there, and use your whole body to listen to others. You're not just using your ears and somehow distracted over here and somebody's speaking over there and you're over here and you say, "Oh, I'm listening. No. Use your whole body, your eyes and your ears, and square up your shoulders so that person understands that you're listening to them. You're creating bad habits of listening. Symptom number 2. The behavior often leaves a seat in the classroom or in other situations in which remaining seated is expected. This is hard. You'll see this in a lot of classes in public school systems, where the teacher will just allow the student, right in the middle of some kind of class instruction, just get up and just walk away from the seat. Just walk right away. And you'll be sitting in the back of a classroom like that, and you'll say, "Whoa, what happened here?" All right, well, that kid's got ADHD, so we've got to give him a little bit of latitude. Wait a minute. No. It may be harder for him than for other kids to sit there still in the seat, but that doesn't mean he can't do it. So what's the counsel you need to give to them? Teach him to be obedient even when he doesn't feel like it. That's the key thing. John 13:17, now that you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. The blessing doesn't come until you do the right thing. Then the blessings come. Then you feel like it. God commanded children to obey their parents, Colossians 3:20, as well as Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 3. And they need to obey and honor the parents. Symptom number 3, the behavior is often runs about or climbs excessively in situations in which it is inappropriate. In adolescents or adults, it may be limited to subjective feelings of restlessness. Boy, that's a real vague category. Subjective feelings of restlessness. Well, that happens to all of you in class, right? So you must have ADD, is the idea. But the counsel here that's given is teach the sowing and reaping principle, cause and effect. That is that which you sow in terms of your responsibility, then you're going to reap a lot of terrible consequences from your responsibility. Prepare your child ahead of time with a put-on, put-off plan for change. Help them to understand it's not enough for them to just merely get rid of the bad activity, but then to replace it with God-honoring thoughts and desires and actions. Symptom number 4 has to do with often has difficulty playing or engaging in leisure time activities quietly. The counsel here is set enforceable guidelines even for leisure activities. Teach the appropriate use of inside and outside voice. All right? That's your outside voice, but you're inside. So you're going to use your inside voice. That means you're going to talk quietly and you're not going to wake up your baby sister. That's your inside voice that you're going to use. Symptom number 5 is often on the go or often acts if he is driven by a motor. All right, what's the counsel that's given here? The behavior can result from constant frustration. Is he failing in school? What subject area and what situation? Are there unresolved conflicts that are going on in his life? What about relationships with friends? Does he have any friends at all? What other changes are really going on in his life, especially in terms of mom and dad's marriage? Structure his day, this is key, with reasonable expectations and a consistent schedule. All right? Structure his day with reasonable expectations and a consistent schedule. This is really important. All right, symptom number 6, often talks excessively. If some of you have done any teaching in elementary school level or middle school level, you'll get some students who always want to answer the question. And they're always talking. They have to talk all the time. They just got to do this. Their hands just constantly in this kind of emotion. All right? They just have to do that. Counsel, discuss corrupt communication versus edifying. Corrupt communication is very self-centered communication. It has to do with me and what I want, all right, in life. That's the more important thing. This particular student's not thinking about anybody else but themselves. Be a peacemaker and not a gossip. Help children become other-centered by learning to serve. All those are critical issues here. Then, symptom number 7 is often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. There are several people. I'm not going to blurt these things out in class anymore. Counsel, respect others by listening again. Again, this activity is very self-centered, like the previous symptom. Don't let pride take over. Don't let pride, because pride will drive that child to always want to be the one who answers. They may know the answer, and it's great. Often ADD children are very intelligent children. And they know. And they'll just blurt it out. 57, that's the answer. 57. And you haven't even asked the question yet as a teacher. Right? As Proverbs 18:13 says, he who speaks before he listens is a fool, right? Is a fool. And that child, no matter how intelligent that child may be, is still, by biblical standards, foolish. All right, symptom number 8. Often has difficulty awaiting turn. All right, stand in line for the drinking fountain, and they got to be up there. They got to be at the beginning of the line. They got to be first. Come on, hurry up. And they're standing there, just kind of, they can't keep their body from shaking. What's the counsel that's given? The problem stems from selfishness again. This is a heart issue. Parents, be sure you're consistent model of putting others first. They need to see this happening in mom and dad's life in order to understand, and then mom and dad can say, now, did you notice what I did there? I didn't do this just to please you, but I did it because I know this is what honors God, putting others first. That's loving others more than the human tendency to love self, as Matthew 22 says. Last of all, symptom number 9, then often interrupts or intrudes on others, butts into conversations or games. Counsel needs to be given here. Be quick to listen and slow to speak. Take the focus off of what I want to say and be focused on listening to what the other person is saying. This is key. Again, the source of this issue is pride. The source of this issue is pride that drives the heart of a child like this. Now, those are the 2 broad categories, inattentiveness and hyperactivity, impulsivity categories. And out of those 18 characteristics, according to the world, 6 of those have to be manifested in order for a person to be properly diagnosed with ADHD. Now let me conclude, and I realize this is not in your notes, but let me conclude with a few instructions about guidelines for counseling parents of ADHD children. And I think this will be a little bit helpful to you. First of all, understand that medical and educational professionals have already persuaded parents that this is a biological problem treatable only with drugs. Understand that you're going into that kind of environment. Just because a Christian parent says that they love the Lord and they're committed to the Bible and doing things God's way and the sufficiency of the Word of God doesn't mean that they necessarily accept the idea that primarily their child is facing a spiritual problem here. And yet that's exactly what that child is facing. It's a heart-related spiritual issue that you can address as a very faithful shepherd. So you've got to understand, in other words, what we're calling upon you to do is be very realistic about the people that you're going to be counseling. Therefore, we would say secondarily, instructing the parents in biblical sufficiency and hope is frequently a necessary prerequisite to helping them work with their child. So these 2 key areas, biblical sufficiency in dealing with ADD problems and hope to really resolve these ADD problems in a non-drug therapeutic way, or in a biblical counseling, or what the psychology would call a talk therapy way, but we would say is biblical counseling perspective, is frequently a prerequisite that you have to give attention to before you even address the issue of ADHD. They've got to be able to look you in the eye and say with all confidence, I believe the Word of God has an answer to my child. If you try to teach them these principles on how to address ADHD and they're not committed to biblical sufficiency, or somehow they think that there really is no hope for change here if you do it God's way, then it's going to be a very futile process. It's going to be fruitless. And you're going to be one of the most frustrated counselors on the face of this earth. Don't put yourself in that situation. You've got to make sure these parents are committed to biblical sufficiency and that they are committed to the fact that the Bible doesn't just have an answer to this problem. It has the only effective long-term answer to the problem. That's hope. That's That's the first vital, important guideline for parents of ADD or ADHD children. Secondly, the second area, biblical requirements for parents to be successful with the ADHD child, and this is important to lay out for them. How can I be assured that I'll be successful in this process? Well, first of all, they have to agree with God's sovereignty. I have a child that requires extra supervision and care. And God certainly did not make a mistake by giving me this child. God's never made a mistake, and He didn't begin with your counselee on this issue. So they have got to agree with God's sovereignty. I have a child. Maybe there are other children, as I mentioned before, were absolutely perfectly obedient. They were easy to raise. But this child presents a really significant problem. This child is going to require a lot of extra supervision and care. I can't tell you how many parents have rebelled at this particular issue. And it's really a rebellion against what God has sovereignly ordained in terms of providence for their lives. Secondly, we have to get the parents to agree with God's purposes. My child may be God's tool of developing my sanctification. That may be God's purpose in this. In other words, the whole issue is not just what's going on in the child's life. The issue is what's going on in the parent's life. This is a child that's really going to challenge them. This is a child that's going to bring them to their wits' end. All right? Where do I go from here? What do I do now? They've got to be willing to agree with God's purposes in this thing. And that is, no matter how hard it is or how long it takes, I believe that it's important that I remain true because God is trying to develop something in me. Maybe it's perseverance, maybe it's endurance, maybe whatever the case may be. Thirdly, agree to stand with God alone. Agree to stand with God alone. I realize other Christian parents may not understand and want me to medicate my child. In other words, everybody else around them are going to say, medicate, medicate, medicate. That's the easiest way to deal with this. You're not being fair. Your child's a victim of a psychological problem and a psychological disease, and they're not going to get out of this by sheer willpower. Da-da-da-da-da-da, and they go on and on and on and on. That's going to be hard to resist that kind of social pressure. And the worst kind of social pressure, really, it's not going to come from the world. It's going to come from within the church. As a Christian, they're somewhat set up to resist the world. But as David said in Psalm 55, he said his worst kind of persecution came from his friends. In Dante's description of hell, the worst part of hell is reserved for friends who have betrayed you. Worst part of hell. That's the hardest thing. Here your friends are saying to you, your close friends are saying to you, and you've got to prepare them to deal with those close friends who are basically going to say, no. The only way to really deal with this is medicate your child. Fourth and finally, you've got to agree with God's Word. Get them to agree with God's Word. Even though I may not have all the answers, I believe God's Word contains sufficient answers for parenting my ADHD child. Even though I don't personally understand all the answers we're saying here, I believe that God's Word contains the sufficient answers for parenting my ADHD child. So what we're saying at this particular point is you have to work hard at helping parents be prepared for the onslaught of emotions and thoughts that will come, most often thoughts of desperation, when they get really frustrated with their child and they want to say, okay, I did this and it didn't work. And you say, well, it's not a matter of just doing this once or twice. It's a matter of doing this for a long period of time for good. So you can't tell me it didn't work because we haven't seen the ultimate demonstration of you practicing this. We've not seen your perseverance. So they have to agree with God's sovereignty. They have to agree with God's purposes. They have to agree to stand with God alone. They have to agree with God's word. What we're talking about here is building a deep, abiding conviction in their life that God has the only answers that will really make a difference here. And they've got to just be obedient at applying those answers. Questions that you have about counseling, ADD, and ADHD? Yes?
I guess it's kind of a confusion, kind of a clearing up. It seems like over the past few years, I've been hearing things and trying to learn about ADD.
Yeah.
It seemed like I was under the impression that this stuff really doesn't necessarily exist. It's just sin issues that need to be dealt with. But in a sense, if somebody's labeled that, we shouldn't necessarily disagree that they don't have this problem labeled this. But instead of just letting it go, it's something that really can be overcome.
Yes.
More, do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're trying to say is that over the years you just considered this to be a sin issue in a person's life or a child's life, and that the ADD problem really didn't exist. And in that sense, you're kind of surprised to hear me describe all these different systems and symptoms and biblical response to them. Well, there is a sense in which I could probably say I don't believe in the artificial label of ADD or ADHD. But it certainly does point out some very true manifestations that children often exhibit, and sometimes adults do, who basically haven't grown up, often exhibit in their lives. It's describing something that's real that happens. This is not some kind of artificial, made-up thing. These things do happen and can be addressed biblically. By parents who are interested in really bringing the Word of God to bear first on their own life. That's what I'm stressing here at the end. And also on the lives of their children. So does that help you?
Yeah, technically, yes. So should we, if somebody comes to us for counseling, and they're on Ritalin, should we work towards getting them off of that, or is that really valid that it does help somebody?
Well, here's what I want to. If somebody comes to us, his question is, and their child's on Ritalin, should we work to try to get them off of that? I don't, as a counselor, try to make that an issue. What I try to do is teach them how the Word of God has an answer to it, and more often than not, then my counselees, who are the parents, will end up saying to me, you know what, I'm not sure my child really needs to be on this Ritalin. I want to really handle this God's way. Well, fine. You go back to a medical doctor, have the medical doctor put that child on decreasing dosage of whatever psychotropic drug that they're on in order to suppress that child's feelings or emotions or activity. And then we'll continue to work on our side from a biblical, motivational, and behavioral level to help that child really develop internal and external discipline of their life. So I don't even try to make the drugs a major issue, other than the fact I will bring the drugs up to the parents and help them to understand the side effects of the drugs. I will do that. And that's one of the reasons why I listed that earlier in talking about this.
Is there any book recommendation if we want to try to better grip this topic?
Are there any books that get a better grip on this particular topic? I know a lot of very good workshops that have been done on soundword.com under the NANC section on ADD and ADHD, done by a lot of good biblical research there. There's also a little pamphlet that has been put put out by CCEF, Christian Counseling Education Foundation, called ADD. That's a good little pamphlet. And Lou Priola also has published a book, How to Handle an Angry Child, which is very, very helpful book as well. In fact, you can get it down here in the bookstore. So I'd recommend those. Those would be real good.
What's this, the war against children primarily?
That has to do basically with drugs. All right, and administering drugs. Bregan is not a Christian, and his wife is not a Christian, but he does have a competent background in the medical field and psychiatry, and he talks about the danger of putting children on these psychotropic drugs, and how he's opposed to it. And boy, he puts together a very persuasive argument.